It is my pleasure and delight to introduce our guest today. Welcome, Deborah. Deborah Adams. Deborah is the Registrar and CEO of the College of Registered Psychotherapists of Ontario, the CRPO. She holds a Master's of Health in Administration from the University of Toronto and has had professional experience in both primary and in regulation. Prior to being appointed at the CRPO in 2017, Deborah had the privilege of being the administrative lead for both palliative care and family medicine for Sinai Health and the registrar at the College of Midwives of Ontario. In her role as Register CEO, um, Deborah is committed to supporting staff, council, committees, and committees in a progressive approach to governance and core regulatory work. So applicable. Welcome, Deborah. We want to turn this over to you. And again, comments in the chat, and we will open up the questions near the end to have some interaction. So thank you, Deborah, for being here.
Thank you, Judy. I'm very happy to be here. If it's okay, I'd like to start with a very brief land acknowledgement. I'm joining you today from the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the Wendat peoples. I'd like to offer that my home is actually close to what we call today the Humber River. This waterway, which was known for various groups as Gabakanang Zibi, among other names, served as a vital Indigenous pathway. It was the southern gateway to the Carrying Place Trail, which was a critical portage network that connected the water we call Lake Ontario with the upper Great Lakes, supporting regional trade, diplomacy, and settlement. When I walk there, which I do at every opportunity I have, I'm struck by how many of the major roads and transit corridors we use today that were actually built on ancient First Nation trails and portages. For me, it's a good reminder to be aware of the stewardship role that Indigenous peoples have carried out here for centuries. And I just ask you to take a moment to reflect on your own home and the rich history of the place and the people who came before us. And as regulators and as clinicians, how we can contribute to closing the gap in health outcomes for Indigenous communities. Mm. So I'm going to jump right in. I'm going to try and dispel as many myths as I can. I'm going to try and keep it sort of fairly flexible and casual, and I would really encourage you to stack up your questions so that if you have them at the end, we can have that conversation and I can cover anything that I miss for you. So the purpose of the session, as the title suggests, is to acknowledge that regulation is often misunderstood and frequently viewed only through the lens of complaints and discipline. So I want to make it clear that the goal today is show that what practicing in a regulated profession actually looks like, as I said, to try and reassure you on as many fronts as possible and to cover the things that matter. I'm aware, all of us in the regulatory world are aware that for many practitioners, especially before regulation happens, it raises important questions and oftentimes concerns about accountability, complaints, and professional autonomy. So I want to jump in and cover what I thought would be useful. And as I said, definitely can cover more once we get to your questions. So along with covering the core areas of regulation, I want to hope to explore how the complaint process functions in practice, including the role of proportionality, right touch regulation. You will be an expert in that if we get through the 90 minutes together. Due process, and I want to highlight how these systems support both public protection and procedural fairness for practitioners. Before I do jump into sort of the real meat of the presentation, I thought it would be helpful to provide a bit of context around the growth of the profession and the context that our college in Ontario is working in. Over the last fiscal year, we've seen an 18% increase in registrants, a 28% increase in applications, and inside those applications, a 47% increase in non-recognized program applications. So that means people coming from some other program besides the 30 or so that the college has recognized, as well as internationally trained and Indigenous practitioners. And so between the end of calendar year 24 and calendar year 25, just to give you like a set amount, we had a 13% increase in total registrants, and it doesn't seem to be slowing down. So on the other side of the equation, we have staff growth going on. We're adding registration staff actually ongoingly. We just had 3 more staff this month start. And we're in the same vein, we're working on application process refinements and continue to monitor the volume that I just described with a view to staying on top of it. We also have additional staff growth happening in quality assurance and complaints. I'll talk a fair bit about complaints when we get further along in the presentation. As I said, I know that's an area that a lot of people want us to focus on. So I'll talk about staffing there relative to numbers. And then for now, just comment that the QA growth is really to provide, whether the intent to provide more regulatory specific supports in continuing professional development. Big focus on council to ensure competence and diversity is part of the work that we're doing. We have more than 45 appointed committee members. They are there to make sure that we are making good decisions in the public interest. So I won't have you put this in the chat, although you're welcome to if you'd like to. I just invite you to think about your perceptions. I'm hoping that my presentation will help respond to most of it, of those things that are there, but I do want to start off with covering a few that we're pretty well aware of and that are out there a lot. The first one we battle is a myth that the public, I think, perceives more than regulators. That's that we are there to cover professional members and to provide support and care to them. Not true. The media coverage certainly in Ontario doesn't help us. We get stories on the regular about doctors getting away with this, doctors getting away with that. So sort of making sure that it's clear that public protection is our main mandate is really critical. Colleges are made of professionals. Absolutely untrue. 51% or more are adversarial towards professionals, which is untrue because colleges are made up of professionals. 51% or more of every council committee and panel has more registrants than it does public members. Every decision is made by actively practicing registrants working with members of the public. Regulators are not transparent. Again, the media doesn't always do us any favors when they report on cases where we can't comment because they're live, in process. But I will say that all our meetings are public. All our council meetings are either live streamed or open to the public. We've been live streaming since COVID, and we intend to stay that way because it means that people from outside Toronto have equitable access to being able to watch the live stream and see what's going on. The materials for our meetings are all available online beforehand. And we have a plethora of reports that go out on the regular. Our annual reports, such as the College Performance Measurement Framework, which is a broad coverage of everything that we get up to across 7 standards. And it's due from all 26 health colleges in Ontario on an annual basis. We also report to the Office of the Fairness Commissioner, who makes sure that we are making registration decisions that are transparent, objective, impartial, and fair. They're particularly interested in international registrants, but they are there to monitor registration practices broadly. And we have our annual report. That regulators tell people in the profession how to provide care. We do set standards, absolutely. And I'll talk about the right touch regulation, but just to preview, registrants set the standard of care. The college then articulates them and holds registrants accountable. So we're not in there telling people how to actually provide clinical care to their patients, their clients. We are there to support excellence in that care. This is a good one. We ask intrusive questions about medical histories. We actually do ask if there's anything that would impact an applicant or a registrant's ability to practice safely. We ask that every year, and registrants are obligated to self-disclose. We do our best in those processes when we hear back from somebody that they have had a medical or mental health issue to make sure we're using universal design to remove barriers to practice where we can. And if we can't remove that barrier, we have rigorous accommodations policies in place to reduce them. If there's something that's impeding our removal, if it's a regulatory requirement that is non-exemptable in the registration regulation, for example. I do appreciate that this can feel intrusive, but the goal is to avoid a fitness to practice matter where we can be proactive in addressing any issues that might exist. So I get it. It doesn't feel nice to be asked to make those kinds of disclosures. And so staff are very sensitive and very careful about how that happens. Regulators require too much continuing professional development. I've been practicing for a long time and I don't need any more CPD. So I'll speak to this a little bit later in terms of how it cashes out for registrants. But what I do want to note is that the 40 hours that we require of RPs in Ontario every 2 years is really not something that registrants typically struggle with. We have people often reporting 400 hours of PD over two years. Last year, we had 7,581 RPs who were obligated to report their PD because it is a biannual a biennial requirement. And 99% of those folks reported their PD and were deemed to either have completed the required hours satisfactorily or they received deferrals for various reasons. So of those more than 7,000, 7,500, only 3 registrants didn't complete the reporting requirements and were suspended. And that was after a long, sort of series of back and forths with many of them, or unresponsive registrants who weren't just online. And so really 3 out of 7,500, not a really heavy burden, I would suggest, given the good success rate. Regulators take too long to process applications for registration. I hear that and I get it. We do sometimes take longer than we'd like to. That's why the staffing comment that I made in the previous slide was there. But I do want to underscore that our approach is competence-based, not credential-based. So this allows people to come through a multitude of different routes rather than just, you have to have a master's from this series of schools. We feel that it respects the different approaches and modalities that exist. There are private programs out there that can't confer degrees, but who've been operating for years and have a long history of graduating really good practitioners. There are Indigenous therapists who've been trained and maybe apprenticed through traditional ways of learning and knowing. They have a pathway in. It needs improvement and we're working on it, but they do have a pathway in under the competence-based approach, as well as internationally educated practitioners who have solid competence and experience, but who may not have a matching degree. So that comparison and the work that goes into assessing people's competence takes a lot longer than it does if we were just ticking a box and saying, great, you have a degree from this school. I'm sure there's more, but I did want to start with the ones that I think might be out there the most and hopefully dispel some of those right from the start. So what does it mean for practitioners? Yeah, absolutely. There are obligations. There's fees, there's reporting, there's professional development, there's being current. There's accountability, but I would actually suggest that most of our registrants, even long before regulation was on the scene, demonstrated really solid accountability to their association's ethics committees, for example, to employers, to colleagues, to themselves, and ultimately to clients. So we don't see accountability as being something that's new and that's only been around since the regulator came online. The positive side, if you will, is that there's also credibility. When I started at CRPO 10 years ago, it'll be 11 years, I guess, in January, I can't tell you how many conversations I had about third-party insurance coverage. Our registrants just weren't covered. They had to work under the supervision of a social worker or under the supervision of a psychologist, and that had, financial impacts on them. It was an accessibility issue for clients. It meant that people just couldn't pick their preferred provider and get care and have it covered. Now, honestly, I can't remember the last time that we had a conversation about coverage not being extended. And that is in part due to regulation. It's part of the, what the insurance companies are looking for. The HST exemption, also kudos to the associations for that work. We didn't do anything directly. We supported it, but we were not the ones lobbying for it. And I'm, impressed with the perseverance that the associations across the country showed to get that. So I'm not for a second suggesting that we're taking credit for the HST exemption, but I will point out that regulation was required in order for that to be something the ministries and the federal government were interested in looking at. I also want to talk about these 3 pillars. If you've heard me speak before, apologies, because I tend to include this slide most times. I want to describe the relationship between education programs, associations, and regulators, because each plays a distinct role in a healthy profession. So we talk about that healthy tension, supporting professional sustainability. So if any one of those things get over-indexed, you're going to have your stool be wobbly and potentially fall right over. So it's important that I acknowledge the great work that goes on at education programs to create solid, competent practitioners, the work that happens at professional associations to support those competent practitioners. We want them to be supported. So along with us as the regulator, I think these, the 3 organizations are the key to stability and sustainability. We're always pleased to work with our system partners, supporting their efforts to provide professional development, to advocate for funding and benefits, and to represent the profession's interests. We just want to stay in our lane because we all have our roles. Different mandates, which create different objectives, but a shared ethical foundation. So this is just a quick comparison. I'm sure none of it is new for folks, but just so you have a reference in the presentation and to underscore that the goals of associations and regulators really do overlap in a significant way. We're all looking at having safe, effective, sustainable providers out there, providing good care to as many folks in the country, in Alberta, and in your case, and in Ontario and mine, as possible. And so we are not working at cross purposes as far as I can tell. A little bit of theory around public value, something that we think about a lot as regulators, and something that we hope is obvious to folks who are working under registration, and something that I think is important for you to be aware of as you head towards regulation. Just Mark Moore is a research professor of public management at Harvard, if anybody's interested in this and wants to track it down. But this is Mark's more strategic triangle. So public value, in our case, it's safe, equitable psychotherapy. The authorizing environment, public, government, and registrants. It's really important. I want to point out that the registrants are part of that authorizing environment. They agree to participate in the work that we do. And then operational capacity. Obviously, staff, tools, our registrant management system, the data that we collect, and then the council, which is the governance body, and the decision-making committees that exist across the college. I think it's important to point out that for any initiative to succeed for registrants or for the college, it needs alignment across these three dimensions. This is especially important for risk-based and DEI-informed regulation, two things that CRPO is fully committed to and investing heavily in making sure we're doing. The framework reminds us that achieving public value requires support from system partners. As I said, it needs the registrants involved and bought in if we're going to have capacity to act. Weakness in any corner of this triangle undermines the effectiveness of the whole system. So pointing back to that sort of three-legged stool, or that healthy tension between educators, associations, and regulators, it's a similar proposition. So I want to talk specifically about how CRPO creates public value, which cashes out as client protection and access, and sort of the mechanisms that we have in place. So protecting the public, that looks like ensuring that only qualified, competent, and ethical clinicians can practice under the title. We investigate complaints, we address misconduct, and we enforce standards to prevent harm. Supporting safe and effective psychotherapy looks like establishing clear standards of practice in partnership with our registrants, to be clear, maintaining professional ethics and entry to practice requirements, and promoting ongoing quality assurance and continuing professional development for RP. So we have that spectrum of continuing competence across a practitioner's life cycle with the college. Building trust in the profession is one of the things that may not necessarily be upfront and obvious, but it is a key piece to making sure that the decisions that are getting made by government, by funders such as insurance providers, and by folks choosing psychotherapists, is that we're maintaining public trust. So what that looks like is having a public register of practitioners, and I will walk you through that so you can sort of see what that looks like and how it increases transparency and informed client choice. We also demonstrate accountability, as I said, through public reporting, that college performance measurement framework, the fairness commissioner, et cetera, et cetera. So all the information that we put out there in the service of making sure people know what's going on. Advancing equity inclusion, as I said, we've made a really big commitment to that at CRPO. We had strategic planning this week, and the council agreed that we need to further embed the principles of DEI into regulatory decision-making and governance. So we've done a number of initiatives, a number of projects that have rolled out over the past 4 or 5 years, I'd say. But the goal now is to be able to respond to systemic inequities through culturally safe and anti-oppressive approaches to regulation, and having that be something that's just sewn into the fabric of what we do, as opposed to tacked on as something that we think about, sort of as an afterthought. Adapting to emerging risks, again, the proactive side of being a regulator. We're looking at using data and system partner input to prioritize risk-based regulation and right touch interventions. We don't want everything, to be a hammer so that everything looks like a nail. We want to really look at things and respond to those risks and be proactive when we see changes in practice patterns, technology, and client needs or public expectations. So these are the basics of what we do. You can see they're sort of laid out. They're tied to the Regulated Health Professions Act. All the colleges do these same things, essentially. What I think is important to notice is the bullets here speak to concepts of public vulnerability, trust, competence, and independent oversight. In short, I think you need to note that governments regulate professions because members of the public often can't independently assess competence before receiving services. So we need their trust. We need the registrants' trust, because we're the front-facing sort of interface or portal to that understanding of what competence looks like, maintaining competence, and then responding when there's a question about whether competence is in place or not. Okay, so this is when I get to the right touch regulation piece. I really love this stuff because I think it's pretty practical, fairly easy to understand, and just makes a lot of common sense. So this is from England. It is from the Professional Standard Authority. It's work that they probably started about 15 years ago when they had some real issues with their regulation. It wasn't working. And so they realized they needed to overhaul the system in order to be able to continue doing it and making sure that they were doing it in a way that was protecting the public. The main theme is that regulation should be proportionate and focused on outcomes. It should not be just a big hammer. It should not be something that, one size fits all. So the message that we take as regulators is don't ever seek to over-regulate. Doing more is not always the answer. And so the guiding principle of this philosophy requires that the college always be mindful of the impact of requirements. So has to have a good outcome, has to really have a significant chance of reducing or removing risk. And we work actively to ensure that we're only using the amount of regulatory force that's required. So a practical example is when we have a complaint, and you'll see the complaint stats later, education versus sanctions. So remediation when there's competence deficit, rather than imposing in a rush terms, conditions, limitations, suspensions, or even revocation. We look at keeping good practitioners in practice as much as we can through this right touch regulation approach. Lots of other ways that right touch regulation comes into force, but that one, I think, in terms of concerns around complaints and where they land up is probably the most salient. This is just a screenshot of our public register. It's online. It should be one of the first things that the public sees when they log into crpo.ca. And again, the goal here is to promote transparency and informed client choice. The RHPA, the Regulated Health Professions Act, actually dictates most of the elements that are on here. Colleges can choose to add more if they so wish. If we do broad consultations. We listen to what registrants and system partners have to say before council decides whether or not they're going to include it. Currently, our register includes people's name, obviously, including previous names. We take requests to hide previous names all the time. The reason they need to be up there is that if you were, practicing as Joe Blow and you decide you're going to be Joe Blow Smith, we want to make sure that if people don't know that you've added that Smith, that they're able to find you if they wanted to make a complaint or raise a concern. But if our registrants indicate that there's a safety or security concern, if they've changed their name post-divorce in an unpleasant divorce situation, we do see that, unfortunately, and we are very quick to take that request and hide that previous name. Likewise, for gender transition, we don't want dead names out there, and so we're pretty quick to hide those things for folks. They only have to ask. We include a business address and practice sites if there are multiple. Again, if we have people who are practicing remotely, exclusively remotely from home, and they don't want their home address up there for security reasons, we also take requests to suppress that piece of information so that it's not there. We don't want to put people in positions where they're uncomfortable. We also provide languages of care. This is completely practitioner-led. So if you speak a second language and you're prepared and comfortable providing care in that language and you want to list it, we're happy to include that. We don't require it. And certainly there are people who may speak a second language but don't provide care in that language. And so that's 100% registrant-driven. We also are obligated to include any other regulatory bodies so that if you're duly registered with, for example, the College of Social Work or the College of Nurses, that would appear there as well. Registration history is included, so category change dates. People can see when you move from being a qualifying registrant to a full registrant to a registrant with independent practice. And then, of course, the piece that nobody likes to think about is notices related to high-risk complaints, outcomes, and discipline. So complaints themselves are not posted, and low-risk complaints where there's not, significant remediation through the specified continuing education or remediation program requirement don't get listed. It's only when there's a high-risk outcome or discipline. The goal is not to shame and blame, but again, going back to my first point, to provide information so the public can make informed choices. And there are mechanisms in many cases where practitioners, short of discipline, can ask us to remove those high-risk complaints outcomes after they've completed all the requirements and a reasonable amount of time has gone past. So that's what's on there. It's a useful tool. I will tell you, I don't think a lot of people necessarily use it. I hope you do. We certainly encourage folks to use it for across the professions. And it goes hand in hand with any other registry that an association might include, as I'm aware that, you know, the associations include more information about modalities and ways of practice and different increments of information that the public might be interested in that you may wish to put out there, but that the college is not, you know, is not sharing. Entry to practice competencies, there's a lot of work that's gone into these. I think that they are, you know, shared across the provinces. In many ways, they started from a base set of competencies that were pan-Canadian. The reason I chose a door for this is because we are really very keen to make it clear that the door goes both ways. And we would not be doing our job if we kept competent ethical practitioners out. So again, back to that, it's not credentials. We're looking to make registration accessible. Note that we are currently reviewing and updating our competencies since they've been around since the college was proclaimed. We're doing it this year to make sure that current practice trends are covered. And we are, you know, making sure that the programs are, the education programs are clued into this as well, so that they can start to prepare people. So we're adding things like emerging technologies, working virtually, although I know that's not emerging anymore, but we're making sure that the competencies cover it. Working with AI, something that's changing by the minute, as I'm sure you're aware. We also are looking to bolster competencies where we see standards being breached frequently, and where we think that the competencies may need some underpinning in order to better prepare people for practice that's safe and ethical. Professional judgment does not go away when your regulator is on the scene. This is back to that myth that we tell people how to practice. We don't. We expect people to have the knowledge, skills, and judgment, and the standards that we develop and uphold are there to support that judgment rather than replace it. Just a reminder again that standards establish minimum expectations. It's the professional judgment that remains central. And so again, connecting to the right touch piece, the idea is to encourage the use of regulatory measures that actually support positive behavior and behavior change where it's needed, and the exercise of professional judgment rather than seeking to be overly prescriptive. We know that if we're like burdening registrants to, you know, sort of the ends of the earth, it's going to make it harder for them to sustain their practice and to be able to keep going in the face of, you know, what I would argue is increasingly difficult community-based practice and organizational-based practices as people become more acute and services are potentially less available in some communities. So onto the standards. We overhauled our standards over the last 2 years. They've been live for about a year now, and they are the minimum base requirements. They are the floor for RPs. They are not the ceiling. We hold people accountable to that base expectation. We know that most of our registrants are routinely exceeding those base requirements. They are the framework that supports competent ethical practice. They, again, contribute to the profession earning and maintaining public trust, and they're responsive to evolving practice environments. We use them to signal to registrants what's expected of them. We use them to shape the education and continuing professional development that we offer, that we require, that we encourage the associations to develop and make available. And then ultimately that's what we use to hold people accountable. So if there's a complaint or a report about someone not meeting a standard, if they've met the standard, but they haven't gone, you know, as far as the client would like them to, we can have conversations with them, but they're held accountable only to that minimum base. Part of how we do this is through the quality assurance program. This lives in regulation. It is required of all health colleges across Ontario. So all 26 of us have a QA program that includes these professional development, peer and practice review, and then professional improvement streams. They are the proactive side of regulation, and frankly, the piece I like the most, because we're helping protect the public proactively. We're not waiting, we're supporting competence before harm actually occurs. So the goals are pretty straightforward: supporting registrants' ongoing self-reflection and professional growth, requiring registrants to engage regularly in a conscious reflection of their practice and to participate regularly in growth opportunities, looking at the risk-based element and covering areas of practice that may benefit from development for the practitioner as much as for us. We want people to know themselves before, you know, we find out that they've got a competence gap, and then tracking and reflecting on professional growth. We changed our program about 3.5 years ago, partly in response to the college performance measurement framework that the government established, which sets standards that say we have to be able to demonstrate in a quantitative way that our programs are current, relevant, and effective, but also because we saw the need to provide a risk assessment tool to our registrants that would support them in their competence, their professionalism, their practice. So we introduced this case-based assessment program that consists of 30 situational judgment cases that people have to complete once every 5 years. We worked with a quality assurance committee and a consultant and more than 50 registered psychotherapists to try and get that diversity of perspective to make sure the cases were relevant and useful. Each case basically outlines a situation and 5 response options. Just really quickly, registrants are asked to rank the 5 options from the most aligned to the least aligned. Again, only once every 5 years. It's not intended to be high risk. It's open book. It's not proctored. It's available online over an 11-day period twice a year. Registrants can complete it twice to get a successful result. Anyone not successful in 2 tries will be provided with peer coaching and an education plan before they're required to try again. On to complaints. This is I want to give this its due diligence so that you can get as much information as possible, and hopefully if there are questions we can get to them at the end. I think it's really important that right at the get-go, I distinguish that there is an important difference between receiving a complaint and being found to have engaged in misconduct or incompetence. The vast majority of concerns that are raised about our registrants never become discipline. So just to give you a benchmark, a stat, in 2025, when we had 17,114 active registrants, we received 182 complaints, 161 reports, and I'll explain the difference between those shortly. And of those 161, 25 became registrar's investigations. Of all of those matters that I just listed, only 14 were referred to discipline. So not to say that it's easy to receive a complaint or to participate in the process, but I thought it was helpful to start with some stats and to really, if my math was better, I'd do the percentage on the fly. You can do it if you have a second in your head. But really very, very small percentage of the complaints and reports that we receive go forward to discipline. So these are complaints allegations. These are typically raised about practice by a client. In a complaint, the person making the complainant is involved in the process. They are privy to the outcome and they have an ability to appeal it at the end. So that's why it's typically clients or client representatives who make complaints. And so I want to show you the difference in allegations between the 2 types, the complaints and the reports, so that you can see, sort of where those things come from. Clients are obviously likely to be more at risk from the sort of forward-facing elements of care. So the kinds of issues that we see are general unprofessional communication, bias in family custody situations. We see that a lot, I'm afraid. Under the heading of undue influence, we see abuse and or manipulation, persuading the client to do something they didn't want to do. So advising them to leave a spouse, end a friendship, threatening the client or having the client perceive that they're being threatened, forcing them to discuss something they're not comfortable with. Those are the kinds of issues that we see in those sorts of complaints. Reports can be made by clients, but they can also be made by the public or other regulated health professions. More often, they're made by other professionals, so colleagues, employers, supervisors. They can be mandatory. There are a set of conditions under the Regulated Health Professions Act where mandatory reports are required in cases where there's sexual abuse or a vulnerable child or evidence of incompetence or incapacity, or they can be voluntary. This is why you see record keeping and supervision, the bottom 2 bars. I recognize the graph is probably pretty small if you don't have a big screen up, but those bottom 2 bars where you see they're the second and third most frequent complaint reports as more significant numbers. Clients are generally less aware of these sort of behind the scenes elements of care. So here you can see the resolution. So what happens in those complaints? Where do they go? 70% of complaints result in take no action. The rest are split between written advice, which is sort of the 7% that you see, a remedial agreement, which is where the registrant agrees to undergo some remediation. They acknowledge that they have had a shortcoming or a deficit and they are prepared to go forward. 7% a remedial undertaking. That's where we require them to do the work that we're suggesting. A SCRP is a specified continuing education and remediation program where we lay out some remediation that they have to do and a timeline to complete it in. But vast majority take no action, meaning get through the unpleasant process of being involved in a complaint and then nothing goes forward. To be clear, we are obligated as the regulator to entertain all complaints that come forward. It's a very, very narrow tolerance for us to be able to say something is frivolous or vexatious. So we do have to go through that investigation process. These are reports resolutions. So you'll see that almost a quarter of those result in take no action. So still a lot less than with complaints, and a little more than that quarter in remediation. No doubt you'll register that there are significantly more take no action outcomes for complaints compared to reports, but I want to just be clear that only reports with reasonable probable grounds, meaning we look at the report and say, yep, there's something here that needs to be formally investigated, only those move forward formally. Most reports are actually resolved informally and quite quickly. I want to talk about our efforts to make regulatory processes less painful, though, for registrants as well as everybody else involved in a complaint or report process. What you're seeing on the screen now are just posters that we use to recruit participants for an external review that the college commissioned. We invited a legal clinic that does a lot of work with women predominantly, not exclusively, but women, vulnerable community members, recent immigrants, people who are going to be at a disadvantage if they're dealing with the law. They have a program where they do research and reviews from an intersectional, trauma-informed perspective. And so we invited them in to do this using focus groups with registrants who had been involved in complaints, with clients who had made a complaint, and anybody else, a witness to the complaint, a supervisor of a registrant who's involved in a complaint, as well as the professionals, the lawyers, the panel members, and the staff, and supervisors and colleagues to sort of get a full 360 of what the complaint process looks like. The goal was to figure out how to modify our approach so that it was as trauma-informed as possible, that we were still, going through all the steps that we needed to make sure that we were carrying out the work in the due process that we're required to, but that we weren't traumatizing anyone involved in the process. We recognized that there was absolutely no benefit in leaving registrants feeling worse off than they had to after they'd gone through a complaints process. We want them to be accountable. We don't want them to be traumatized. So I think that, just really quickly, these are some of the recommendations. There were others, but these ones I think are the ones that are probably the most interesting. And despite what I believe are reassuring outcomes that I shared in a couple slides ago, we wanted to make sure that the process, as I said, was as little trauma as possible. So these tangible outcomes that are up and running are in place, and they're shaping how we approach complaints. So third-party complaint policy, for example, deals with complainants who are neither the client nor their authorized representative. So third-party complainants can include former spouse, a parent, or an insurance company. We use the policy to ensure that sensitive information isn't divulged unnecessarily, while still ensuring that the panel is able to make a fully informed decision. We don't want people feeling like they're, vulnerable. Health records are being put on display for anybody that really doesn't need to see them. The policy on declining complaints is one that benefits registrants. It ensures that we are using college resources appropriately. So as I said, we have to take all complaints seriously. The ICRC, our Inquiries, Complaints, and Reports Committee, can decline to further investigate a number of complaints in accordance with the legislation. Again, pretty narrow, but it's still something that we take very seriously. So for example, we don't get involved in personal disputes that don't involve professional incompetence, misconduct, or incapacity. You had a fight with your neighbor, they decide to complain about you, we're not interested. Repetitious complaints after the first one regarding the same issues. So if somebody's unhappy with the outcome and they just keep coming back with more information about the same complaint, we don't entertain that. Complaints made for ulterior or improper reasons, so harassment, legal bullying, to influence the outcome of separate dispute. So for example, families where they're trying to relitigate a family court outcome that they're unhappy with. And then matters that are better addressed in another form. So something that should be in front of the courts and not in front of the regulator are things like financial compensation claims, intellectual property rights, and a request to access health records that aren't related to your psychotherapy. The last one, the policy on accommodations, really strives to make the process more accessible for everyone, including, again, the registrants, witnesses, anybody else involved. We're incorporating universal design as much as possible in our processes. So we strive to actually remove barriers entirely so people don't have to ask for accommodations. This removes burden, and stigma, we hope, and ultimately makes processes more accessible for everyone. So a concrete example would be, for instance, parties involved in a complaint have the option of making an audio or a video submission rather than a written one, if that's what they need to do. I just want to move to sort of like the other side of things so you understand how we work and who's overseeing what we're doing. So who regulates the regulator? There is an extensive accountability framework surrounding regulators. First and foremost, the Ministry of Health. We answer to the minister. Our current minister, I can assure you, would not be shy, wading in if they heard, if there were complaints that we weren't doing a good job. So we're not out there as the last frontier. There's also the Officer of the Fairness Commissioner. As I said, I believe you have one in Alberta. Their job is to make sure that we're transparent, impartial, objective, and fair in our registration decisions. We also have the Health Professions Appeal and Review Board. Any applicant who is unhappy with a registration decision, clearly one that declines them or imposes significant terms, conditions, and limitations before they can register, can appeal to the Health Professions Appeal and Review Board. Likewise, if you make a complaint or you are the subject of a complaint and you're unhappy with the outcome, you can also make an appeal to HPARB, and we have to explain ourselves. HPARB typically doesn't get involved in what the decision was. They leave it up to the college to do that. But what they do is they assess that our process was fair, that it was thorough, and that everybody had a reasonable and equal chance to make their case. And then the public, we have appointees to council. We have public members sitting at the table, and they are well aware, we remind them if they're not, that their job is to represent the public voice, and they do a good job of that. We also are obligated in some instances to do consultations. If we want to change a regulation or a standard, then we're obligated to do, or by law, we're obligated to circulate that to registrants and system partners. We typically do it for many things, guidelines, standards, procedures, as many things as we feel we will benefit from registrant input, we put out there. We also invite the associations to represent their members so that we can hear from folks in an organized manner as well. And then ultimately, obviously, the courts. If there's something that we can't sort out between us, then people always have the right to go to court for a review of a college decision. Really quickly, I just want to talk about governance. We are overseen by a governance body, a council. They contribute directly to public trust, and we invest a great deal in ensuring that competence and diversity of council and committee members is there so that public decisions or decisions in the public interest are made with the perspective of people who represent the public in a way that is meaningful. It's a big commitment. The work that we ask of folks is not insignificant. It's actually a commitment I hope you would consider making once Alberta's up and running and working regulation. I know a lot of you are involved with your association on committees and boards. It's not that different, and it, really is what makes regulation work. We provide extensive training. We have a competency matrix that we ask people to aspire to if they don't already have when they first arrive. So they get training specifically in regulation and all the pieces that fall under that. We also do a lot around adjudicative decision making, so they're ready to sit on panels. And then we look at things like bias and conflict of interest and DEI training so that we have really solid folks on their feet, comfortable, making sure that they know what they're doing when they're asked to make a decision. And then we have the staff team, including me. As I said, we have about 63 folks now. We're getting quite big. Our job is to support the decision makers. Council steers, we row. They are absolutely the decision makers in all these matters. Really quickly, again, I just want to make sure I'm leaving time for us to have some questions at the end. There is a real push for modern regulators to attempt to prevent harm rather than merely sit and respond to it when it actually shows up. So we use evidence to improve outcomes in the same way that a lot of industries are doing that. I'll offer a specific quality assurance lens just because again, on the proactive side of the ledger, when the QA committee established the blueprint for that case-based assessment, or CBA, they used a risk register that measured risk and frequency, risk severity. It was based on how often issues showed up within college committees, so discipline, complaints, reports. At the Practice Advisory, which we run and answer, thousands of questions a year. What are people asking about? What are they struggling with? Where are the near misses happening in terms of people's ability to meet the standards, as well as other system partner input. So what do the associations have to say? What do our registrars have to say? What do other health providers have to say who are working in teams with our registrants? And then risk severity obviously is determined by reviewing the significance of the outcome. So, was the complaint one that we took no action on, or was it one that actually led this individual to discipline? As well as the priorities of our system partners. What is it that the public and the associations and the government and the educators are telling us we need to be worried about? So knowing this allows us to create an assessment within the CBA that gives registrants information about their own risk, as well as giving the college information about risk exposure, so that registrars can address gaps proactively before they create problems. Data is really critical. We've done actually a lot of training over the last little while in data literacy and the translation of data literacy into good decision making in the public interest, so that we can assure our registrants who are working under regulation that we have competent people working with good data in terms of the decisions that get made. So council and committee members, we make it very clear to them, they're expected to challenge information appropriately. So anything that gets presented to them for policies or for individual cases, they need to really interrogate whether it's the right information. They need to be able to identify, prioritize, and balance risk. So not to get carried away with something that's not a risk, and to make sure we don't miss things that are actually risky, and to make proportionate right touch regulatory decisions. So since decisions are data informed, regulators need to know what the data can tell them, what it cannot tell them. We need to know when to ask better questions or more questions. So we conduct in-depth and regular reviews of all our complaints, our reports, and our discipline data in particular, as well as I said, the case-based assessment, the practice advisory inquiries, and all the other things that are coming in. But we use this to determine which elements of practice are the most likely to create an issue for registrants. In other words, where are standard breaches that could cause client harm the most likely to happen, and how can we address them proactively through the CBA, through education offerings, through revisions to standards, or the addition of supportive guidelines. So data-informed regulation is the real watchword now. It's a common sense piece, and should be very firmly in the minds of anybody who's involved in this work. I just want to wrap up by giving you a list of the emerging issues that are affecting regulated professions right now, and in particular that are affecting registrants in Ontario, and the things that the college is keeping an eye on and doing our best to steer proactively around and to respond to. So those are all up there. They're across the spectrum of our registration, our quality assurance, and our conduct departments. And I'm assuming the slides will be available afterwards, so you can take a look at those. If there's anything that you're interested in hearing more about, we can talk about it now in terms of the questions that you might have. And I'm always happy to engage with people by email, and I'll share my email at the end. So just wrapping up, I hope I've given you a sense of the purpose of professional regulation and the value and the role that it plays in supporting safe, ethical, and competent practice. I hope I've clarified how modern regulatory approach really seek to balance public protection, professional judgment, and procedural fairness. We are not out to get anybody. We are out to make sure that we are playing our part on that three-legged stool. And I hope I've provided some insight into the resources, supports, and processes that might be available to help practitioners succeed in a regulated environment.